Imagine a world stretched taut, almost to the point of tearing, between two starkly different realities. In one reality, the old world of Europe, there exists a semblance of order, a complex tapestry of customs, traditions, and laws that have evolved over 1,000 years. There are courts, established legal precedents, and a theoretical, if often brutally violated, framework of justice that at least pays lip service to the idea of a common humanity under a common God. But then, imagine stepping onto a ship, a small, creaking, impossibly fragile wooden vessel, stinking of bilge water, unwashed bodies, and fear. You surrender yourself to the vast, indifferent, and seemingly endless ocean. When you step off that ship weeks or months later, you are not just in a new land. You are in a new reality, a new world, a world where the familiar rules seem to dissolve in the humid, alien air, where the legal and moral boundaries of your home continent have been stretched so thin they have become transparent, and then have snapped altogether. This is the world of the European colonial project, a world born of a fervent, often contradictory, mix of motivations. A crusading religious zeal, an insatiable greed for gold and silver, a desperate thirst for personal glory, and a ravenous, world-altering hunger for land and resources. It was an age that saw the greatest and most rapid expansion of European power in the history of humankind. But this expansion was not a gentle, civilizing unfolding. It was a violent, chaotic, and often systematically genocidal collision of cultures. And at the very heart of this collision, serving as its engine and its enforcement mechanism, was a system of punishment and control designed to subjugate, to terrorize, and to extract labor and obedience from millions of people, from the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas and Australia to the enslaved Africans forcibly brought to the shores of the New World. Picture a Spanish conquistador, a man named Nuno de Guzman, in the sun-scorched highlands of western Mexico in the 1530s. He believes, or tells himself he believes, that he is on a divine mission, bringing the light of the one true faith to a land of pagan darkness and human sacrifice. But he is also driven by an insatiable, all-consuming hunger for gold. When the local Tarascan chieftain, a man named Calzonson, welcomes him peacefully but fails to produce the impossible quantities of treasure he demands, Guzman's methods of persuasion become monstrous. He has the chieftain bound, his feet greased with oil and slowly roasted over a fire. He uses a water cure, forcing gallons of water down his throat. And when the broken man still cannot produce the gold that does not exist, Guzman has him tied to the tail of a horse and dragged through the streets before being burned alive. This is not justice. This is business. Now, picture a sugar plantation on the island of Barbados in the 18th century, an island paradise transformed into a green industrial hell, the richest colony in the British Empire. An enslaved man named Kwasi, driven beyond the limits of human endurance by endless work under a blistering sun, attempts to flee into the island's interior. He is caught by the militia patrols. The punishment must be a lesson to all others, a piece of public theater designed to terrorize the enslaved population into submission. He is given 200 lashes with a whip made of knotted cowhide, a whip that tears the flesh of his back into a bloody, unrecognizable ruin. But that is not enough. His raw, weeping wounds are then rubbed with a mixture of salt, pepper, and lime juice to intensify and prolong the agony. He may be forced to wear a heavy iron collar with long, projecting spikes, preventing him from ever lying down comfortably or seeking refuge in the dense brush again. Or, for the ultimate crime of rebellion, he might be broken on the wheel, his limbs systematically shattered with an iron bar, or, in a particularly favored method of terror, he might be suspended in an iron cage, a gibbet, and left to die a slow, public, agonizing death from thirst, starvation, and the relentless attacks of insects and birds. This was the grim reality of justice in the colonial world. It was a terrifying fusion of old-world cruelty, the tortures of the dungeon and the executioner's block, with new world paranoia and a limitless sense of racial and cultural superiority. It was a system where the line between punishment and pure, unadulterated sadism blurred into non-existence. This was colonial torture, a vast and varied landscape of pain, meticulously designed to enforce a new and violently imposed world order. Welcome to Torture History. Today, we hoist a black sail and journey into the heart of darkness. We will explore the brutal punishments that were the engine of European colonization, from the Spanish conquests in the Americas to the vast slave societies of the Caribbean, from the British ventures in North America to the Dutch trading posts in the East Indies and the penal colonies of Australia. This is a story of how the quest for God, gold, and glory created a world of almost unimaginable, systematic cruelty. It's a journey into a new world that for millions of its indigenous and enslaved inhabitants was not a world of opportunity and rebirth, but a world of chains, whips, and unending, state-sanctioned terror. So, pour yourself a drink and prepare to confront a chapter of our shared global history that is often sanitized, ignored, or deliberately forgotten. but one that is absolutely essential to understanding the deep and painful roots of the world we live in today. To truly understand the unique character and scale of colonial torture, we must first grasp the psychological and legal space in which it occurred. The great European colonial ventures, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, took place in what legal philosophers would later term a state of exception. The men who led these expeditions, the conquistadors, the colonial governors, the plantation owners, the trading company factors, were thousands of miles and months of arduous, dangerous travel away from the direct oversight of their home governments. The normal legal constraints, the social pressures, and the community standards that might have tempered their actions in Madrid, London, Paris, or Amsterdam were effectively non-existent. In the colonies, a governor or a plantation owner was, for all practical purposes, a king holding absolute power of life and death over the people under his control. This physical distance was compounded by a profound psychological distance. The Europeans who arrived in the New World encountered peoples whose cultures, religions, social structures, and ways of life were radically, fundamentally different from their own. This difference was quickly and almost universally interpreted not as simple human diversity, but as a sign of profound inferiority, of savagery, of a lack of civilization, and ultimately of a lack of full humanity. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were often seen as childlike, irrational, lazy, and demonic, their complex religions dismissed as mere devil worship. Enslaved Africans, ripped from their own diverse and sophisticated societies, were systematically dehumanized, legally classified in colonial codes not as people, but as chattel, as property, as res, a thing no different from livestock or a piece of furniture. This process of othering, of dehumanization, was a crucial psychological prerequisite for the industrial-scale cruelty that followed. It is much easier to inflict pain on someone, to work them to death, to sell their children, if you have first convinced yourself that they are not fully human, that they do not feel pain in the same way you do, or that their souls are already damned and thus their earthly suffering is of no consequence. The Spanish, for example, engaged in long, elaborate theological debates, most famously the Valladolid debate of 1550 to 1551 between the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas and the humanist scholar Juan Gínez de Sepúlveda, over the question of whether the indigenous peoples even had souls and were capable of rational thought. While the official position of the Church and Crown eventually came down on the side of their humanity, the very fact that this was a serious, high-level debate at all reveals the prevailing mindset. This dehumanization allowed the colonizers to create and maintain a starkly two-tiered system of justice. There was one set of laws and customs for Europeans, and a completely different and infinitely more brutal set of rules for the colonized and the enslaved. The brutal punishments we are about to discuss were not, for the most part, punishments that a European would inflict on another European for a similar crime. They were reserved for the other, the people who were seen as obstacles to profit and impediments to power. Let's begin our journey where the European colonial project began in earnest, with the Spanish conquest of the Americas. The Spanish conquistadors who followed in the wake of Columbus were a unique and formidable breed of men. They were often men of minor nobility, hidalgos, hardened by the centuries-long reconquista, the brutal, intermittent war to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslim Moors. They were driven by a potent and highly volatile cocktail of motivations. A fervent, crusading Catholicism that saw itself as the army of God, a desperate and almost chivalric desire for personal glory and honor, and an almost pathological, feverish lust for gold. When they arrived in the Caribbean and later in Mexico and Peru, they encountered vast, complex, and wealthy civilizations. But they did not see partners for trade or souls for gentle conversion. They saw pagan empires to be overthrown, resources to be plundered, and bodies to be put to work. The primary tool of their conquest was not superior technology, though their steel swords, crossbows, armor, and horses were a significant military advantage against peoples with no experience of them. Their primary tool was terror. Calculated, spectacular, psychological terror. The accounts of men like Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who arrived in the New World as an encomendero himself before having a profound crisis of conscience and becoming the most fierce and famous critic of Spanish cruelty, are a harrowing, stomach-churning catalogue of atrocities. In his book, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, intended to shock the Spanish king into action, he describes a systematic campaign of colonial torture and mass murder. One of the most common and psychologically devastating methods of terror was the use of war dogs. The Spanish brought with them massive mastiffs and Irish wolfhounds, specifically bred and trained for war. These dogs were unleashed on indigenous villages with the cry, "Tomalos! Take them!" They were trained to disembowel people, to hunt down fleeing natives in the forest, and to tear children from their mother's arms. Las Casas writes, "The Spaniards trained their hounds, fierce dogs, to tear natives to pieces at a word. They made a law among themselves, that for one Christian whom the Indians killed, the Christians should kill 100 Indians. This was not just a weapon of war. It was a form of psychological torture, designed to instill a deep, primal fear in the native population. a fear of being hunted and devoured like animals, a profound dehumanization. When it came to extracting information, specifically the location of gold, the conquistadors employed methods they had learned during the Inquisition back home, but stripped of any legal pretense or theological justification. Burning the feet was the common technique. A local chieftain or cacique would be captured. His feet would be greased with oil or lard, and they would be slowly roasted over a fire until he confessed the location of his community's treasures. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, famously had his feet, and those of his cousin, the Lord of Tacuba, burned by Hernán Cortés for this very reason. Legend holds that when his cousin screamed in agony, Cuauhtémoc rebuked him, asking, "Am I, perhaps, in some kind of a delight or bath?" Mutilation was also a routine form of punishment and terror, used to enforce labor quotas in the mines and on the plantations. A native who failed to bring in his required quota of gold dust from the rivers might have his hands cut off and tied around his neck, and then be sent back to his village as a walking, bleeding, and dying warning to others. Noses, ears, and lips were also common targets. This was not just about causing pain. It was about marking the colonized body, demonstrating absolute power over it, and using human beings as living messages of terror. And then there was the mass, indiscriminate, almost gleeful slaughter that characterized the early conquest. Las Casas described Spaniards making bets on who could split a man in two with a single sword stroke, or who could decapitate someone more cleanly. He describes them building low, wide gallows and hanging natives in groups of 13, in memory of our Redeemer and his 12 apostles, positioning them so their feet could just touch the ground to prolong the strangulation, before lighting a fire beneath them and burning them alive. He writes of them snatching babies from their mothers' breasts and smashing their heads against the rocks. This initial wave of conquest-era brutality was a form of shock and awe, aimed at breaking the will of the powerful Aztec and Inca empires. But once the conquest was complete, a new, more systematic system of exploitation was put in place. The encomienda system. In this system, a Spanish colonist, the encomendero, was granted the tribute and labor of a number of native people. In theory, his duty was to protect them, pay them a wage, and instruct them in the Christian faith. In reality, it was a system of chattel slavery by another name. The natives were forced to work in horrific conditions in the silver mines of Potosí in modern-day Bolivia mountain that, over the centuries, consumed the lives of millions of indigenous and later African laborers on the great agricultural estates, the haciendas. The punishments for failing to work hard enough, for disobedience, or for attempting to escape were brutal. Flogging was ubiquitous. Men and women were stripped naked and whipped until their backs were raw. They were placed in stocks, their limbs forced into painful, cramped positions for days on end, exposed to the elements. This relentless cruelty, combined with the devastating and unintentional impact of old-world diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza to which the natives had no immunity, resulted in one of the most catastrophic demographic collapses in all of human history. Within a few decades of Columbus's arrival, the indigenous population of the Caribbean island of Hispaniola fell from several 100,000 to a mere few hundred. It was almost completely wiped out. The population of central Mexico is estimated to have fallen by as much as 90% in the first century of Spanish rule. This was a silent, microbial holocaust, but it was a holocaust that was aided and abetted by the very real, very human cruelty of colonial torture and forced labor. As the indigenous population collapsed, the colonizer Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch needed a new source of labor to work their immensely lucrative sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. They found it on the west coast of Africa. Thus began the transatlantic slave trade, one of the largest forced migrations and one of the most sustained, industrialized crimes against humanity in history. If the cruelty of the early conquest was hot-blooded, chaotic, and aimed at terror and plunder, the cruelty of the plantation slave system was cold, systematic, bureaucratic, and rational. It was a form of terror meticulously designed for one purpose: to maintain absolute control over a large, captive, and hostile workforce and to extract the maximum amount of labor for the maximum amount of profit. The plantation was a totalitarian state in miniature, and the plantation owner was its absolute dictator, its lawgiver, its judge, and its executioner. The legal framework for this system was laid out in colonial slave codes, such as the infamous French Code Noir of 1685, the Spanish Código Negro, and similar slave codes in the British and Dutch territories. These were legal documents that explicitly defined enslaved people as property, movables in the French Code, meaning movable goods, with no rights as human beings. The codes laid out a terrifyingly detailed schedule of brutal punishments for various infractions, giving legal sanction to acts of unimaginable cruelty. Let's examine the anatomy of plantation justice in more detail. The central instrument of daily control and motivation was the whip. There were many varieties, each with its own cruel properties. The cat-o'-nine tails, a multi-thonged whip, was common. In the British colonies, The cowskin or bullwhip was favored, a long, heavy, braided leather whip capable of cutting flesh to the bone with a single, expertly delivered stroke. A standard punishment for a minor offense, like working too slowly, breaking a tool, or being deemed insolent, might be 50 lashes. For a more serious offense like theft of food or a first attempt at escape, it could be 100, 200, or even more lashes. These floggings were not administered in private. They were highly ritualized public spectacles. The victim would be stripped, often regardless of gender, and tied to a ladder, a tree, or a purpose-built whipping post in front of the entire enslaved community, who were forced to watch. The overseer or a designated driver would administer the lashes slowly, counting them out, to prolong the agony and to make an indelible example of the victim. But the cruelty often did not end with the whipping. To intensify the pain and to, in a perverse form of care, prevent infection of the valuable property, the overseer would then order the raw, weeping wounds to be rubbed with a brutal concoction of salt, pepper, or even rum and lime juice. This practice, known as pickling or buckrashing, would cause a secondary wave of unimaginable, searing, fire-like pain. For repeat offenders or those who attempted to escape, the punishments escalated into the realm of permanent mutilation. An enslaved person might be branded on the face or chest with their owner's initials, a permanent, undeniable mark of their status as property. For the crime of running away, a common punishment was to have the hamstring tendon at the back of the ankle severed, permanently crippling them and making further escape impossible. Or an ear might be cut off. The French code more explicitly prescribed this escalating scale of terror. For the first escape attempt of a month or more, the slave would be branded with a fleur-de-lis and have their ears cut off. For the second, they would have their hamstrings cut. For the third, they would be put to death. To prevent further escape attempts, captured runaways were often forced to wear elaborate and cruel iron contraptions for months or even years. A heavy iron collar, sometimes weighing 20 or 30 pounds, might be locked around their neck. Often, this collar would have long, projecting spikes, making it impossible for the wearer to move through dense undergrowth or to lie down and sleep comfortably. Sometimes, a bell was attached to this contraption, so their every movement could be heard by the overseer. Another device was a metal mask or brank that locked over the head. These often included a metal bit that depressed the tongue, making it impossible to speak or to eat properly. This was used to punish those who were accused of eating sugar cane in the fields or who were deemed to be habitual complainers or singers of defiant songs. But the ultimate crime in the slave society, the one that triggered the most profound fear in the hearts of the white masters, was rebellion. Any act of organized resistance, any plot to overthrow the masters, was met with a level of theatrical, sadistic cruelty designed to strike terror into the hearts of every enslaved person for hundreds of miles around. The goal was not just to kill the rebels, but to do so in the most agonizing and spectacular way possible, to create a lasting, traumatic memory of terror that would crush the spirit of resistance for a generation. Breaking on the wheel, a punishment we've examined in its European context, was imported to the New World and used with terrifying frequency against rebel leaders. The victim would be tied spread-eagled to a large cartwheel or a wooden St. Andrew's cross. The executioner would then, using a heavy iron bar or a sledgehammer, systematically shatter every major bone in their arms and legs, taking care not to strike a fatal blow to the head or torso. The broken, mangled limbs would then be braided through the spokes of the wheel, and the wheel would be hoisted onto a pole, leaving the still living victim to die a slow, agonizing death over several days from shock, dehydration, and the attacks of birds and insects. They were a living, screaming scarecrow, a public monument to the price of freedom. Burning alive was another favored method, particularly in the French and Spanish colonies. But this was not the relatively quick burning of a European heretic at the stake, where a large fire was intended to suffocate the victim quickly. This was roasting, or death by slow fire. The victim would be chained to a post, and a small, greenwood fire would be lit a few feet away, slowly cooking them from the feet up, deliberately prolonging the agony for as long as possible, sometimes for hours. Eyewitness accounts from places like Jamaica and especially the brutal French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, describe these horrific scenes in stomach-churning, clinical detail. One particularly gruesome form of punishment, favored by the British, was suspension in an iron cage or gibbeting. The victim would be placed, sometimes after hanging, but often while still alive, in a form-fitting iron cage and hung from a tree or a specially built gallows in a prominent public place, such as a crossroads or the entrance to the plantation. They were left to die of thirst, starvation, and exposure. This was a slow, public, and agonizing death that could take over a week. Their decaying body, picked apart by birds, would be left in the cage for months, a skeletal, rattling warning, until the bones fell to the ground. It is absolutely crucial to understand that these were not the isolated actions of a few rogue, sadistic individuals. This was a system, These brutal punishments were legally sanctioned by colonial codes, they were publicly performed as a matter of policy, and they were seen by the white planter class as absolutely necessary for the preservation of their profitable and precarious slave society. The religious fear that helped to police European society was replaced in the colonies by a raw, naked, physical terror. The plantation owner held the power of life and death, and he used it with horrifying creativity to maintain an order built on the absolute subjugation of one group of people by another. But what about the British colonies in North America, the colonies that would eventually become the United States? Was the system there any different? In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. The economy of the northern colonies like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania was not as dependent on large-scale plantation agriculture, and the ratio of Europeans to enslaved Africans was much lower. However, slavery existed in all the colonies, and the punishments could be just as severe. But it was in the southern colonies, from the tobacco fields of Virginia and Maryland down to the rice and indigo plantations of South Carolina and Georgia, that a slave society emerged that was just as brutal, if sometimes less theatrically sadistic, than that of the Caribbean. The whip was the primary tool of enforcement. Flogging was a daily, monotonous reality. Branding was common. Mutilation, while perhaps less frequently prescribed in law than in the French colonies, certainly occurred, often at the whim of the master. And the psychological torture of the system was profound and all-encompassing. The most powerful tool was the deliberate destruction of the family. Slave families were not legally recognized. Husbands, wives, and children could be, and routinely were, torn apart and sold to different plantations, often hundreds of miles away, never to see each other again. This was a deliberate strategy of control, designed to break down kinship ties and prevent the formation of strong, unified communities that could foment rebellion. It was a form of cruelty that targeted the very heart of what it means to be human, the bond of love and family. And when rebellions did occur, like the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 or Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia in 1831, the response from the white power structure was overwhelming, indiscriminate, and ferocious. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of enslaved people, many of whom had no connection whatsoever to the rebellion, would be rounded up and executed without trial by panicked militias. Their heads would be cut off and placed on pikes along the roadside as a warning. A scene straight from the darkest annals of old-world tyranny, now recreated in the New World. It is also important to note that colonial torture was not only directed at enslaved Africans. The indigenous peoples of North America also faced horrific violence as the frontier of settlement pushed westward. The Pequot War in the 1630s in New England, for example, culminated in the infamous Mystic Massacre, where English colonists from Massachusetts and Connecticut, along with their native allies, surrounded a fortified Pequot village at night and set it on fire. They shot anyone who tried to escape the flames. They killed hundreds of men, women, and children. The Puritan leader and governor of Plymouth Colony, William Bradford, described the scene in his journal as a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, but justified it as a sweet sacrifice and a righteous judgment of God upon the heathen. This brings us back to the crucial, indispensable role of ideology in sanctioning this cruelty. The colonizers, whether they were Spanish Catholics obsessed with rooting out heresy or English Puritans who saw themselves as God's new chosen people in a new promised land, had a powerful set of beliefs that justified their actions, at least to themselves. They saw themselves as agents of civilization and Christianity, bringing order and light to a dark and savage world. This civilizing mission, this white man's burden, was a powerful psychological tool. It allowed them to commit acts of unimaginable cruelty while still seeing themselves as good, moral, and righteous people. They were not just conquering and enslaving for profit. They were doing God's work. The brutal punishments they inflicted were not signs of their own savagery, but necessary, if regrettable, measures to tame the savagery of others. This ideology also created a deep-seated, abiding fear of the colonized. The colonizers were, in most of these societies, a small, heavily armed minority, surrounded by a vast population that they were brutally oppressing. This created a state of constant, simmering paranoia, the fear of a slave revolt in the night, the fear of a native uprising from the forest, the fear of losing control. This fear, in turn, fueled a vicious cycle of ever-increasing cruelty. The more they feared the colonized, the more brutally they punished them to keep them in check, and the more brutally they punished them, the more they had to fear their eventual bloody revenge. Colonial torture was not just a tool of control. It was a symptom of a deep and abiding colonial anxiety, a fear that was the dark twin of its own arrogance. The legacy of this era of brutal punishments is long, deep, and painful. It did not end with the abolition of slavery or the independence of the colonies. The systems of racial hierarchy, the ideologies of dehumanization, and the patterns of state-sanctioned violence that were established and perfected during the colonial period have cast a long and dark shadow over the history of the Americas and, indeed, the entire world. The lynchings that terrorized African Americans in the post-Civil War American South, with their public, ritualized, and spectacular cruelty, were a direct echo of the public terror of the plantation execution. The legal and social systems of segregation and apartheid were a direct continuation of the two-tiered justice of the colonial era. The profound economic and social inequalities that persist to this day around the world have their roots in a global economic system that was built on the stolen land of one people and the stolen labor of another. The story of colonial torture is a profoundly uncomfortable one. It challenges the heroic, sanitized narratives of exploration and settlement that many of us were taught in school. It forces us to confront the fact that the prosperity, the liberty, and the modernity of the Western world were built, in large part, on a foundation of unimaginable suffering and exploitation. But it is a story that must be told, because to understand the dark history of the New World, we cannot just look at the grand monuments, the declarations of independence, or the tales of brave pioneers. We must also be willing to enter the stifling heat of the sugarcane fields, to stand at the whipping post, to listen to the screams from the quemadero. We must understand that for the vast majority of the people who inhabited this new world for the first 3 centuries of its existence, the defining experience was not one of liberation and opportunity, but of systematic, soul-crushing, and endlessly inventive cruelty. The colonial project was, at its very heart, a project of pain, and its echoes, its ghosts, and its consequences can still be seen and heard today, if we are only willing to look and to listen. Thank you for joining us on this harrowing journey into the history of punishment and torture in the colonial era. It is a stark reminder that the quest for wealth and power, when combined with a sense of absolute racial and cultural superiority, can often lead humanity down its darkest and most blood-soaked paths. If this deep dive into the brutal punishments of the New World has been informative and thought-provoking, please support our channel by liking this video and subscribing to Torture History. Click the notification bell to ensure you don't miss our next investigation into the shadows of our shared past. And now we want to hear your thoughts. How does the context of colonization, the vast distance from home, the profound dehumanization of the other, the immense economic incentives for cruelty change our understanding of torture when compared to, say, the theological motivations of the Inquisition? What do you believe is the most lasting and significant legacy of this era of colonial torture in our world today? Let us know in the comments below. Your insights and discussions are what make this community so valuable. Until next time, remember that history is not always a story of progress, and that civilization is often a very thin and very fragile veneer.